For years, the monarchy has survived crisis after crisis, but nothing compares to the night King Charles finally snapped. Behind polished palace walls, where silence is currency and secrets are law, a single conversation, one that was never meant to be heard, slipped through the cracks. It was Camilla'S private call with Prince Harry, and when that recording reached Charles, something inside him broke, unleashing a storm nobody in the royal household was prepared to face. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What began as a quiet evening slowly twisted into a moment Charles would replay again and again, unable to decide whether he was more stunned by the betrayal or the painful truth embedded in Camilla'S tone. The monarchy had already been stretched to its limits, public pressure, internal fractures, and a lingering sense that the crown itself was trembling under the weight of endless scrutiny. Courtiers whispered of exhaustion settling over Charles like a shadow, pressing into him with the heavy reminder that kings are expected to endure even when they are already breaking. Yet no one anticipated how close that breaking point truly was. The recording arrived in a small, sealed envelope, delivered by a palace aide Charles had trusted for decades. There was no explanation, no signature, no note, only a single audio file marked with the timestamp of a late-night call between Camilla and Harry. Charles's breath caught as the first words surfaced. Camilla'S voice was steady, gentle, painfully honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be within palace walls. It was a tone reserved for raw confessions, soft enough to soothe, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. As Charles listened, he felt anger rising like a fire he no longer had the strength to contain. Betrayal surged through him. Shock hit harder. But beneath those emotions was something far more dangerous, a piercing sense of dread. The monarchy thrived on predictable loyalty. This was something entirely different. Each word Camilla spoke carried the weight of truths Charles had tried desperately to keep buried. Truths he feared outsiders would use to tear the institution apart. Her emotional honesty, intended only for Harry's ears, exposed the fragile threads holding the royal family together. Charles replayed the recording, scrutinizing every breath, every pause, every confession. He could feel loyalties shifting like sand beneath his feet, the delicate balance between duty and emotion slipping away. And in the background, unseen but unmistakable, the palace machinery began to stir. Senior courtiers sensed the change almost instantly. Whispers echoed through hallways, questions surfaced. Doubt began to spread, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as the king's mood darkened into something volatile, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. What Charles didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment was only the beginning. The recording would ignite tensions far greater than a single conversation. It would expose old wounds, fuel hidden agendas, and pull the monarchy into a storm it was never prepared to face. A storm built from fear, secrecy, and the quiet, devastating knowledge that even the heart of a king can fracture under the weight of truth. But to understand why this single conversation pushed the king past his breaking point, we must go back to the moment Camilla spoke the words Harry was never supposed to hear. It was meant to be a private plea, whispered across continents, a moment of raw honesty from the queen consort to the son who once viewed her as an invader. Camilla never expected the world to hear the doubts she carried in silence, the fears she dared not share with anyone else, and the truth she hoped would reach Harry before the monarchy shattered around them both. In that vulnerable moment, she set aside titles, expectations, and the rigid etiquette that had guarded her for decades, reaching out not as the queen consort, but as a woman desperate to stop a slow-moving disaster she could feel building beneath the surface. She made the call alone, without permission, without advisors, without the cold machinery of palace protocol to shield her. This was her voice, unfiltered, uncertain, quietly trembling beneath the weight of everything she had been carrying while the world believed she remained unshakable. And when Harry answered, she exhaled in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in months. Camilla began with hesitation, skirting around the edges of what she truly wanted to say, until the silence between them forced her to reveal the truth she feared most. Charles was slipping emotionally, mentally, under pressures that were invisible to the public but deeply corrosive behind closed doors. She confessed that the crown was crushing Charles from the inside, grinding away at the man beneath the monarch, leaving him brittle, overwhelmed, and increasingly volatile. She admitted she'd watched him struggle to balance the impossible expectations placed on him with the grief, frustration, and resentment he still carried like an old wound. These were truths she could not speak to courtiers, truths she dared not whisper to Charles himself. But Harry had lived through the emotional fractures no one else understood, and for a moment she hoped he might be the one person who could help her ease the burden before Charles broke under the weight of it. But as the conversation deepened, Camilla'S voice shifted. She revealed the unsettling tensions brewing throughout the palace, the strategic moves from senior courtiers who wanted her pushed aside, silenced, or replaced by someone more compliant. She spoke of private meetings held without her knowledge, instructions delivered behind her back, and advisors who viewed her as an obstacle rather than an ally. The pressure to maintain unity around the king was turning into pressure to erase her influence entirely. It was a confession she had never intended to share. Yet she felt Harry needed to understand just how fractured things had become. And in a moment of unguarded honesty, she pleaded with him quietly, emotionally, to stop making everything worse. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea from someone who could feel the fabric of the monarchy pulling apart thread by thread. Then came the final blow, the truth she had held closest to her chest. The secret she whispered into the quiet of that call because she believed Harry deserved to hear it before the world eventually learned it on its own. It was a truth tied to Charles's reign, one that carried the potential to reshape the monarchy's future, and Camilla'S voice cracked as she admitted it, knowing it could change Harry's understanding of everything he thought he knew. She hoped the confession would bridge the chasm between them. She hoped honesty might stop the collapse she feared was coming. But she never imagined that this fragile, private moment would be twisted into a weapon. Yet it wasn't Camilla'S fears that sent shockwaves through the palace. It was what happened after the call ended, when someone made the fateful choice to leak it. Leaked conversations inside the monarchy don't accidentally slip into circulation, they're weapons. And the moment Camilla'S call with Harry surfaced, palace insiders instantly recognized the signature of a deliberate strike. Someone wanted Charles enraged. Someone wanted Camilla exposed. Someone wanted the family divided beyond repair. The recording didn't drift through palace corridors like a harmless rumor. It arrived with precision, almost as if it had been placed directly into the bloodstream of the institution, engineered to sow maximum distrust. And as the shock rippled outward from the king's private office, a new and chilling awareness took hold. This wasn't simply a breach of privacy. It was a declaration of war from inside the walls of the monarchy itself. Beneath the polished exterior of royal order, a shadowy circle of palace staff operated with quiet authority technicians, communications specialists, private secretaries, and senior aides, who handled everything from confidential calls to encrypted transmissions. They were the unseen hands behind the royal machinery, trusted to protect secrets that could topple governments. Yet as the scandal erupted, those same individuals became suspects. Whispers spread through narrow hallways and guarded offices. Did a senior courtier engineer the leak to sabotage Camilla'S influence? Did a disgruntled staff member see an opportunity to shift power from behind the scenes? Or, far more dangerously, was a royal rival pulling strings to destabilize the king at a moment of vulnerability? The deeper the palace dug, the clearer the pattern became. The leak showed unmistakable signs of a coordinated digital extraction data pulled from a secure line, duplicated, encrypted, and delivered with clinical precision. Nothing about it resembled an accident. It was deliberate, targeted, and calculated to inflict emotional damage. Departments that normally worked in quiet cooperation now eyed each other with suspicion. Accusations, barely whispered, grew sharper. Aides who once breezed through offices with cheerful familiarity now carried tension in their steps. Every department felt threatened, and every individual wondered whether they would be the next one dragged into the silent inquisition tightening around the palace. For Camilla, the realization struck with brutal clarity. She had been spied on. Not by a faceless public, not by the press, but by someone with access to the palace's safest channels. Someone close. Someone brazen enough to reach into her private world and use her vulnerability as ammunition. She felt the walls closing in, not from public scrutiny, but from the cold recognition that the true danger lived among the people sworn to protect her. And with every passing hour, the question clawed at her. Who listened, who recorded, and who gained from exposing her? But the most unsettling discovery didn't come from the leak itself. It came from the timeline. Quietly, discreetly, senior aides began piecing together when the recording changed hands, who heard it first, and who delayed its arrival to the king. When the truth surfaced, it carried a chilling weight. Charles had not been the first to hear Camilla'S private confession. He had been one of the last. The recording had been circulated internally, analyzed, whispered about, and strategically withheld until someone finally decided the moment was right to deliver the emotional blow directly to the king. The leak wasn't designed merely to embarrass Camilla, it was crafted to destabilize Charles himself. And while the palace scrambled to uncover the traitor, Charles listened to the recording alone, hearing not betrayal from Camilla, but something far more destabilizing. Kings are not supposed to feel fear, but when Charles heard Camilla express doubts she'd never dared say aloud, it struck at the core of his fragile confidence. For a man raised to suppress emotion, the recording exposed his deepest insecurities, and worse, revealed that even his wife questioned whether he was strong enough to wear the crown. In the silence of his private study, with the door locked and the palace unaware of the storm building inside him, Charles replayed the call again and again, clinging to every syllable, as if the tone itself might reveal why the woman he trusted most had allowed her voice to tremble with uncertainty. Each word became a wound, each pause a quiet indictment, each confession an echo of the doubts he had tried to bury beneath years of discipline and duty. The more he listened, the deeper he spiraled, dissecting Camilla'S tone, questioning her intent, and revisiting moments from their past through the harsh new light cast by her honesty. In his mind, questions clashed with emotions he could no longer restrain. Had Camilla betrayed him without realizing it? Had Harry manipulated her, encouraging her fears to weaken the monarchy from afar? The thoughts twisted through him like threads, pulling tighter and tighter, until paranoia seeped into the cracks of his composure. If Camilla had confessed her anxieties to Harry, who else had she confided in? Who else in the palace whispered behind closed doors about the king's growing fragility? Charles felt the cold weight of suspicion settle over him, as he wondered whether he had unknowingly become a subject of palace gossip. A king carefully examined by those waiting for him to falter. As he listened to the recording yet again, his fear of being perceived as weak surged to the surface with violent force. It was a fear born decades ago, one that had followed him from his youth into the throne, a room, whispering into the back of his mind during every public appearance, every speech, every moment. The world stared at him with impossible expectations. The pressure to appear unwavering had always sat heavily on his shoulders, but now it threatened to crush him completely. Camilla'S words, spoken softly and without malice, reopened wounds he had spent a lifetime pretending did not exist. And as those old insecurities collided with the fresh sense of betrayal, something inside him hardened. Charles felt the shift in himself, the point where fear ceased to be a quiet shadow and became a driving force. With each replay of Camilla'S confession, the determination to regain control grew sharper. He refused to allow uncertainty to define his reign. He refused to be perceived as a monarch unraveling under pressure. The recording became a reminder that trust within the palace had become fragile, that loyalty had to be monitored, and that silence could no longer be mistaken for support. In the dark solitude of that room, Charles made a vow, one he spoke only to himself, yet felt echo through the halls of the monarchy. He would restore control at any cost, no matter who stood in the way, no matter what had to be cleaned up, no matter how ruthless the process became. He would not allow doubt to corrode the image of his reign. But Charles's private anger wasn't the only fire spreading because Harry, unaware of the leak, was about to be dragged into a confrontation he never saw coming. When Harry discovered the palace had recorded and leaked Camilla'S private plea, He felt a surge of emotions he hadn't experienced since his final days as a working royal. Shock, guilt, and a deep, slow-burning resentment that his family would rather weaponize vulnerability than heal the wounds it exposed. The news reached him not through a family call, not through an official statement, but through the same swirling network of media whispers he had tried so desperately to escape. A quiet alert from a journalist he barely knew, a cryptic message hinting that someone inside the monarchy had crossed yet another line. As he listened to the audio for the first time, his heart sank, not just because Camilla had reached out behind Charles's back, but because the palace had chosen to exploit her honesty instead of protecting it. The moment the recording ended, Harry felt an overwhelming ache settle in his chest, a mix of guilt for being the person she confided in and anger at the institution that twisted her vulnerability into a strategic attack. He sat in silence, trying to make sense of the emotional collision happening inside him. Camilla's voice was softer than he remembered, tinged with fear and exhaustion, revealing truths she likely never intended to carry alone. Harry heard something he had never expected. A woman pleading for help, not from a prince, not from a former royal, but from someone who understood the emotional fractures that came with living under the monarchy's shadow. He didn't resent her for calling. He resented the palace for violating her trust so ruthlessly. Yet at the same time, a sharp sting of shock pierced through him. Why had she felt she couldn't speak to Charles? Why had she believed Harry was the only person who would listen? Her decision unsettled him, not because he doubted her sincerity, but because it revealed just how fractured the family had become, fractured in ways even he hadn't fully grasped. When he told Meghan, she immediately sensed the emotional gravity pressing down on him. She urged caution, reminding him that the palace had always used personal moments as political tools, but she also saw the way his expression changed when he played the recording again. Harry wasn't just angry, he was hurting. He listened closely to the tremble in Camilla's voice when she spoke of Charles's emotional unraveling, the pressure crushing him from the inside, the fear she carried silently while the world believed she was unshakable. Those words hit Harry with unexpected force. They reminded him of his father's quiet fragility, the side of Charles he had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments. And as he listened, guilt crept in, whispering that maybe, without meaning to, he had played a role in deepening the cracks that now threatened to split the monarchy apart. But sympathy didn't erase the anger tightening in his chest. If the palace had truly cared about Camilla's well-being or Charles's stability, the recording would have been buried, not circulated. Instead, it had been extracted, analyzed, and leaked with chilling precision. Harry began to see the truth with startling clarity. Someone inside the palace had used Camilla to reach him, to provoke him, to corner him emotionally. And as he thought back on the years of manipulation, the public battles, the private betrayals, a new resentment formed, sharp, heavy, undeniable. They used her to get to me, not out of loyalty to Charles, not out of concern for the monarchy, but because Harry had become a lever, a pressure point, a target they could strike from across an ocean. As the weight of the recording settled into his thoughts, Harry understood that this wasn't just another scandal. It was a warning, a signal that the palace was willing to cross any boundary, violate any trust, and sacrifice anyone, including Camilla, to maintain control. And with that realization came an unsettling sense of anticipation, as though something even more volatile was already moving in the shadows, waiting for him to react. But while Harry wrestled with emotions, palace forces were mobilizing because Charles demanded answers, and he wanted a confrontation on his terms. When the king is wounded, the monarchy bleeds with him. Charles did not call for comfort or counsel, he called for control. Behind a locked chamber door, surrounded by the advisors who feared him most when he snapped, Charles prepared the response that would drag the entire royal family into a confrontation decades in the making. The atmosphere shifted the moment the advisors entered. No one dared speak first, and no one dared meet the king's eyes for too long. They could feel the fury radiating off him, not loud or explosive, but simmering with a dangerous intensity that signaled a man who had been pushed far beyond his limit. His composure was sharper than ever, yet everyone sensed the tremor beneath it, the fragile mix of humiliation and rage, threatening to burst into something far more destructive if he wasn't handled with precision. Charles began by summoning his oldest loyalists and the more skeptical figures who had risen to prominence in recent years. He wanted them all present, those who supported him unconditionally and those who questioned his decisions behind closed doors. His voice was low, steady, and chillingly firm as he announced that the leak had not been an accident. It was orchestrated, planned, and executed by someone inside the palace. The declaration sent a ripple through the room. Advisors exchanged nervous glances, each silently calculating how far the blame might reach. Charles's gaze swept across them with a scrutiny none of them had experienced before. And in that moment, they realized the king was no longer seeking reassurance. He was hunting answers, and loyalty was now a test, not an expectation. He issued directives with a precision that startled even the most hardened courtiers. An internal probe was to be launched immediately, one unlike anything the palace had ever undertaken. Every communication channel, every encrypted file, every digital footprint from the past several weeks would be examined. He granted unprecedented surveillance powers to a select group, authorizing them to monitor even the most private exchanges within the royal household. The advisors hesitated for a moment, realizing how invasive these measures would be. But Charles's expression made it clear that hesitation was no longer tolerated. The leak had crossed a line, and he intended to cross lines in return. Then came the order that shifted the emotional landscape of the room. Camilla, he insisted, was to remain silent. No statements, no clarifications, no attempts to explain herself or the call. His tone held a sharpness that revealed the tension lingering between them. The advisors could sense, even without speaking, that the marriage had been shaken by the recording, not just by its content, but by the realization that Camilla had spoken truths Charles was not ready to confront. By silencing her, he was regaining control, but also creating a fracture that deepened the longer it went unaddressed. As Charles continued outlining his command, panic began to settle in the corners of the room. Senior courtiers, long accustomed to palace intrigue, shifted uneasily as they realized alliances were being tested in real time. Conversations that once seemed harmless could now be interpreted as betrayal. Old rivalries reawakened. Some advisors instinctively positioned themselves closer to Charles, eager to appear loyal, while others stepped back, calculating their survival should the probe reveal something unintended. The palace, already strained, now pulsed with fear and self-preservation. But Charles wasn't finished. As the final order of the meeting, he instructed his private secretary to draft a message, one that would bypass advisors, bypass public relations, bypass every barrier between a king and the son who had wounded him far more than he ever admitted. This wasn't a diplomatic inquiry or a plea for reconciliation. It was a demand infused with the weight of a monarch who felt betrayed from every direction. The room held its breath as Charles described the tone, the urgency, the unmistakable authority it needed to carry. It was a message designed to pull Harry back into the storm, whether he wanted to be part of it or not. That message, delivered with the weight of a wounded monarch, would ignite the next explosive clash. They had avoided this moment for years, but when Charles demanded answers, Harry knew he couldn't hide behind silence any longer. What followed wasn't a conversation. It was a collision of decades of resentment, fear, loss, and love twisted into something unrecognizable. The tension between them ignited the instant their voices met. The kind of tension born not from a single betrayal, but from a lifetime of misunderstandings and unresolved wounds. Charles opened with accusation, sharp and unrestrained, claiming Harry had exploited Camilla'S vulnerability for his own advantage. He framed the leaked call as proof that Harry had manipulated the Queen Consort's fears, twisting them into ammunition against the monarchy. The words hit Harry like an unexpected blow, not because they were harsh, but because they revealed how deeply his father misunderstood him, and how quickly the king had allowed his pain to transform into suspicion. Harry fired back without hesitation, telling Charles that if anyone had used Camilla, it was the palace. He insisted the institution had weaponized her honesty, turning her emotional plea into a political bomb designed to force a reaction, not to seek healing. His voice cracked under the weight of frustration, years of feeling unheard bursting through all at once. He reminded Charles that he never asked for the call, never encouraged it, and certainly never expected Camilla'S fears to be thrown back at her like a crime. The moment Harry mentioned the palace's role, the air shifted. Old wounds surfaced with ferocious speed. Diana's name, unspoken yet unmistakably present, hung between them like a ghost neither could escape. The pain of her absence, the arguments she never resolved, the trauma both men carried in their own ways. All of it surged to the surface, fueling the fire instead of calming it. Harry felt the familiar ache of abandonment, the memory of being left to navigate grief and duty without the emotional support he desperately needed. Charles felt the sting of old accusations that he had failed as a father, as a protector, as a man capable of balancing his own heartbreak with the demands of raising two sons beneath the glare of public scrutiny. The past and present collided so forcefully that neither could separate one from the other. In the heat of the exchange, Charles's voice broke just enough to reveal the truth he had tried so hard to hide. "They think I'm unfit," he admitted, barely louder than a whisper. It wasn't anger speaking, it was fear, raw and unguarded. It was the dread that had been festering since Camilla'S call, the fear that the monarchy he fought to uphold was slipping through his fingers as his weaknesses became ammunition for those waiting to replace him. Harry froze at the confession, shocked not by the words themselves, but by the vulnerability behind them. It was the closest Charles had come to admitting he felt threatened, not by his son, but by the very people surrounding him. And for a fleeting moment, the hostility between them softened into something painfully human. Harry took a breath, steadying the turmoil inside him, and responded with a clarity that cut through the room like a blade. "Then stop listening to courtiers and listen to your family." It wasn't just advice, it was a plea. An attempt to remind Charles that power meant nothing without trust, and that the voices whispering in the shadows had far more to gain from division than unity. Harry pushed him to see that the people feeding his doubts were the same people tightening their grip on the monarchy with each crisis. Charles looked at him, torn between pride and the desire to finally acknowledge a truth he had avoided for years. But the moment passed. The vulnerability dissipated. Pride and fear reclaimed their positions, and neither man stepped toward reconciliation. They ended the confrontation not with apologies, not with understanding, but with a heavy silence that carried more pain than any words they could have spoken. They walked away, shaken, each feeling the weight of what had been said, and the even heavier weight of everything left unspoken. No bridges were burned, but none were rebuilt either. The distance between them remained steady, cold, and reinforced by years of unresolved grief. Yet even as father and son clashed, the palace was hiding the most explosive truth of all: the identity of the leaker. Everyone expected a rogue aide, a rival department, or a disgruntled staffer. But when the truth finally surfaced, it stunned even Charles into silence. The leak didn't come from a palace enemy, it came from someone dangerously close to the throne. From the moment the internal probe began, the monarchy braced itself for embarrassment, but no one anticipated the devastating revelation that the call had been extracted by a senior communications official entrusted with safeguarding the crown's most sensitive information. The discovery hit like a blow to the ribs. This wasn't an amateur mistake or an impulsive act born from anger. The extraction had been executed with precision, care, and intent, too calculated, too polished to be the work of someone acting alone. As investigators dug deeper, the veneer of a simple betrayal crumbled, revealing something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The deeper the probe went, the more it became clear that the communications official was merely a conduit, not the mastermind. There were hidden directives, encrypted exchanges, and timestamps that exposed coordination impossible to dismiss. Someone had issued orders, quiet, deliberate orders from a far higher level of authority. And as each layer of secrecy was peeled back, the probe circled closer to the heart of the royal family itself. The palace, already strained by Charles's anger and Harry's emotional turmoil, now found itself facing a truth it could barely comprehend. A high-ranking royal had orchestrated the leak. A member of the family had weaponized Camilla'S vulnerability, manipulated palace staff, and engineered a scandal designed to destabilize both the king and queen consort. The betrayal wasn't administrative, it was personal, it was strategic, and it had been unfolding in the shadows with terrifying calculation. When Charles learned the identity of the mastermind, the shock nearly hollowed him. Someone he had trusted, someone who stood close enough to influence public perception and internal decisions, had turned against him with a motive that chilled him to the core. This royal figure sought to undermine Camilla, weaken Charles's confidence, and accelerate a shift in power, one that would position them closer to the center of influence, perhaps even closer to the throne. The rationale didn't come from hatred, but from ambition. They believed Charles's emotional fragility made the monarchy vulnerable, that Camilla'S unfiltered honesty damaged the institution, and that drastic intervention was necessary to protect the crown. But their version of protection was nothing less than a controlled collapse, orchestrated from within by someone who believed they could rebuild the monarchy in their own image once the dust settled. Charles demanded a private confrontation. For the first time in his reign, the mask of royal calm cracked enough to reveal both fury and heartbreak. The mastermind didn't deny their involvement. Instead, they justified it with a chilling logic. The monarchy needed strength, and Charles was losing his grip. They warned him that exposing the truth would ignite a scandal so catastrophic it could shatter what remained of public trust. They claimed the monarchy could survive Charles's anger, but not another internal war made public. Their final warning cut the deepest. If Charles insisted on revealing the truth, he would expose his own weaknesses along with theirs, and the monarchy would collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. Faced with a decision no king should ever have to make, Charles realized the truth presented a greater threat than the betrayal itself. The scandal, if exposed, could destroy the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. And so, with a heavy resignation that carved itself into his posture, Charles chose secrecy. He buried the truth deep within palace archives, silenced the communications official with quiet reassignment, and allowed the mastermind to remain in the shadows untouched, unpunished, but watched. The decision saved the monarchy, at least on the surface. But it came at a cost. Trust within the royal family fractured into pieces that could never be mended. But silencing a truth this volatile never ends it. It only buries it alive, waiting for the next crisis to drag it back into the light. The monarchy survived the scandal, but it did not survive unchanged. The trust shattered, the alliances shaken, and the unspoken truths festering beneath the surface left wounds that would define the future of the crown. Because once a secret is leaked inside the palace, nothing ever goes back to normal. In the days that followed the revelation, an icy distance formed between Charles and Camilla, subtle enough to avoid public scrutiny yet unmistakable in the privacy of their shared life. He didn't accuse her again, nor did he revisit the recording, but the silence between them grew into something heavier than any argument. Camilla felt the shift immediately, the way Charles lingered in his own thoughts, the way his voice carried a stiffness she had never heard before. She understood he wasn't angry with her, not truly, but with the vulnerability she had exposed, both his and hers. And while she tried to bridge the gap with quiet reassurances, Charles retreated behind the walls he had spent decades building, walls that now locked her out more firmly than ever. Across the ocean, Harry felt those same walls rising around him. The confrontation with Charles lingered in his mind like a bruise that refused to fade, reminding him of every painful moment that had led them here. He withdrew again, not out of spite, but out of resignation. The leak had confirmed what he had feared for years, that the palace would always choose control over connection, strategy over sincerity, and silence over healing. His distrust deepened, not only toward the institution but toward the family members who allowed themselves to be shaped by it. Even Meghan noticed the shift, watching as Harry became quieter, reflective, carrying a weight that didn't need to be spoken for her to understand. He wasn't angry anymore. He was tired. tired of being pulled back into the chaos he tried so hard to escape, tired of problems that were never solved but constantly reborn in new, more painful forms. Inside the palace, the atmosphere changed in ways no one could ignore. Courtiers who once operated with confidence now moved under the shadow of Charles's newly imposed surveillance measures. Every message, every conversation, every seemingly harmless exchange was scrutinized. Staff whispered about the king's growing paranoia, though none dared say the word aloud. Loyalty tests became more subtle, yet more ruthless. Departments that once collaborated began to function like separate kingdoms, their members fearful of being associated with the wrong faction at the wrong time. The palace had become a quieter, colder place, an institution haunted by the knowledge that the enemy had not come from outside, but from within. Camilla felt the shift most painfully. She sensed her enemies circling, emboldened by the scandal and by the growing tension between her and Charles. Invitations she once received effortlessly were now delayed. Meetings she once led smoothly were now conducted with a caution that bordered on disrespect. She understood the unspoken message. She was vulnerable now, weakened by the leak, a figure to be sidelined rather than supported. The isolation grew heavier with each passing day, but she held her composure with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms before, even as she wondered whether this was the storm that would finally undo her. Outwardly, the monarchy maintained its polished composure for the public. Statements were controlled, appearances carefully managed, and the scandal was buried deep beneath layers of protocol and performance. But internally, the damage was irreversible. The crown had been shaken in ways the public would never fully understand. The family moved forward, but every step carried the echo of betrayal, fear, and unresolved guilt. Charles's paranoia lingered like a shadow at his side. Camilla's vulnerability became a quiet wound she carried alone. Harry grappled with the guilt of being the one Camilla trusted and the one the palace continued to weaponize. And beneath it, all was the chilling knowledge that the truth they buried was still alive, still dangerous, still capable of igniting another crisis with a single whisper. And so the monarchy marches forward, but beneath the crowns, behind the ceremonies, the scars from Camilla'S leaked call with Harry remain, waiting for their next chance to unravel the royal family once more. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.